Once upon a time, I'll start my story that way. Sometimes people think what I say is autobiographical. Usually it's not. So I was lying on the couch once upon a time watching the Orioles beat the Yankees. And a little boy came and knocked on my front door. And I came and he said, "You have something of mine in your garage and I'd like it back." Okay, so I went and I opened the garage door and I looked in, and there were two items that were present that are not usually among the contents of my garage. One was a baseball, and the other was a baseball-sized hole in the garage window. I looked at the little boy and I said, "Little man, how do you think that ball got in here?" And he looked at the ball, and he looked at the hole in the window, and he looked at me and said, "Wow, I must have thrown it through that hole in the window right there." When we get in trouble, we hope that the evidence will bail us out. When we get in trouble, we hope that there will be sufficient evidence that will get us off the hook. My middle son, Caleb, was taking some friends home one evening after Young Life Club, and he was going south on Route 74 in York, Queen Street, leaving from York, going to Dallastown, and he was in the little village of Spry, and a big big white tractor trailer pulled right past him to his left. Caleb was driving on the right side of the road like he was supposed to be doing. And behind the truck, a little Toyota was drafting right up there behind the truck. And they decided that they were going to turn left. And right there in front of Caleb, it turned left right in front of him. He had nowhere to go and he T-boned the car. Now, you've been at the scene of an auto accident, or you've witnessed them perhaps. The guy jumps out of the car and starts waving his arms all around and making faces like Caleb had just ruined his life. And so the police came, and police do what the police do. They began to take notes, and they questioned the principals in the accident, and then they questioned whatever witnesses were available. And the policeman came over to Caleb and said, "Son, you have nothing to worry about. I'm going to cite the other driver. The other driver was totally at fault. In a couple of days, you'll get a piece of paper from a police report so that you can take that to your insurance. That driver failed to yield to oncoming traffic, and you have not a thing to worry about." Evidence is important. We kind of hang our hat on evidence. Why is the pastor talking about evidence this morning? Don't Christians just believe? Doesn't the world tell us that faith is just this close our eyes and take a blind leap into the universe? That there is no evidence. It's just something that we feel in our hearts. I don't like that definition of Easter. I don't like that definition of evidence. When I was a teenager, I was a skeptic, and I, like my children, I went to Young Life when I was a teenager. It's a Christian outreach, a Christian club for non-Christian kids. And my Young Life leader gave me what I think is a better, more satisfying definition of faith. He defined faith as resting on the sufficiency of the evidence. Resting on the sufficiency. Evidence. There's evidence for this? It's not just believe, you just believe it. There's evidence. He said, "Well, look into it." And he gave me a book by a guy named Josh McDowell. It's called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And since I was in high school, it's now got a second volume, and it's now either in one copy, one big fat book, or two little thin ones. And in that book, I came across the name of a guy I'd never heard of before. His name is Sir Lionel Luckhoo. And he is famous in England. He was knighted twice by the Queen of England. He is a barrister. They say of England and America that we're two people divided by the same language. That's just a fancy word for he was a lawyer. And he was famous because he was able to get 245 people off on charges of murder. 245 in a row. He was a genius. He would sit down and he would sift the evidence, and he would distill it all down, and he'd bring it down to a nub, to a kernel. This is what the trial is really about. And then he would make pains to either prove or to disprove, which was ever in the best interest of his client, this nub, this kernel about what they're at court for this murder trial. And he was tasked one time by somebody, "Why don't you look at the evidence for Jesus and tell us what you think about that?" So he read the Gospels. He read the extra biblical information by Josephus and Philo and others. It's not just in the Bible, but there's historical record about these events. And so he took it and he sifted it and he distilled it down. And he said the faith can be distilled to these three questions. Did Jesus die? Was the tomb empty? Was he buried? And then, did people see him after he died? I was a pastor in a small town in Pennsylvania for quite a while, and I had a period of 8 years where I did 88 funerals, almost one a month. And we would go out to the cemetery and we'd say our words and we'd sing our songs, and then we would go home, and we wouldn't expect to see the person that we left behind at the cemetery again this side of glory. We leave them there. That's the norm. That's what we expect. That's what most people understand. And yet here we have gathered together on this Easter morning, not to celebrate that Jesus is dead, moldering in some grave somewhere, but that he rose from the dead. Well, again, Christians, you're just committing intellectual suicide. You believe things that nobody else believes, and it's just crazy talk. And so I want you to consider what Sir Lionel Luckhoo said. He examined the evidence. He came down to these three questions, and he said the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ on Easter is incontrovertible. It is the best explanation of the facts that we have available to us. So the first thing he asked was, did Jesus die? In our text in John's Gospel, they're coming to the tomb. Jesus was dead. Jesus had been buried. He's lying in the tomb, dead. And Mary comes, and I love John's Gospel. Mary is the first apostle. Apostle is a Greek word. It means messenger. It means sent one. She went to the tomb. Where are the disciples? Panty waist. They're hiding out in the upper room. They've got the doors locked. They've got the shades drawn. They're afraid because the Jews or the Romans are going to come and get them. And they're hiding out. But not Mary. She goes bold as brass right up to the tomb. And there's nothing in the tomb. And so she goes and she gets. Now, Jewish law says of women that they're hysterical. That they're inherently unreliable as witnesses. They're just a walking feeling, and we can't trust anything they say. So the first witness to the resurrection in the scriptures, in the gospel accounts, is Mary. So nobody's going to take her word for it. So she goes and she gets Peter and John, and she brings them back to the grave. Now we've got, for Judaism, we've got two grown men. They're reliable witnesses. And they confirm what she already knows. There's nobody in the tomb. The first question, did Jesus die? Why would anybody ask that question? In the late 18th century, end of the 1700s, early in the 1800s, there began to be a school of critical scholarship, particularly in Germany, where they wanted to get rid of, shed Christianity of all the miraculous, all the supernatural elements. And so they wanted to kind of explain away the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And they came up with a theory that was called the swoon theory. That Jesus didn't die on the cross, that Jesus just fainted, he just passed out. And because he didn't hang on the cross as long as the others, when they laid him in the cool of the tomb, he revived and he pushed the stone out of the way, and he tiptoed through the Roman guard there that was by the tomb, and then he showed himself to his disciples and told them, I was dead, but now look at me, I'm alive. That's how they explained away the first question that Sir Lionel Luckhoo asks. Was he dead? Well, there's two parts to that. The first is the trial of Jesus and Jesus' scourging. That Pilate this guy's helpless, this guy's harmless, this guy hasn't done anything, and I don't really want to put him to death. I mean, he was kind of a bloodthirsty guy, but Jesus wasn't giving off the vibe that he was dangerous, and so I know what I'll do. I'll torture him a little bit, and then the Jews will feel sorry for him, and then I'll, at the Passover, do what I do every year, and I'll offer them one of my prisoners as a gift on Passover, and I'll have this revolutionary guy named Barabbas, this zealot, and then I'll have their teacher, and I'm sure they'll take their teacher. So he had him taken off and scourged. So they take him to the barracks of the Roman guard, the Roman soldiers. And in the courtyard, there is either a big wooden block, and they strip them down to just their loincloth, and they lay them over the wooden block and secure their hands under the block, drawing the skin tight. Or there's a post and there's a ring at the top, and they tie their arms to it, and it's on a chain or a rope, and then they pull them so that the skin is taut. And then they whip them with a Roman flagellum. It's a braided whip, but it isn't just leather whip. At the end of each of the strands, there are like fishing weights, lead balls that are pressed into it, and pieces of shattered, broken bone with sharp edges are threaded on to these braids. And then this job was just so utterly gruesome, so deplorable, that hardened Roman soldiers often would have to get drunk in order to go out and do what they were required to do. And Jesus was whipped with this flagellum 39 times. The lead balls bruised and beat and pulverized the muscle. The bones ripped and shredded the skin. An eyewitness to one of these Roman scourgings said at the end of the process that their back was just long ribbons of flesh, and that their bowels, their backbone, their ribs were exposed, that you could see everything that was in there. Jesus was reduced to hamburger meat. Jesus was reduced to human rubble. He was already in serious or critical condition on the basis of the scourging that he received. They put a robe on him, and they took him back to Pilate, and Pilate asked, "Do you want Barabbas or do you want Jesus?" And the Jewish leaders stirred up the rabble, and they cried out, "Crucify Jesus, crucify him, crucify him." And so Pilate's hands were tied. And so they ripped the robe off. They put the crossbar of the cross on his shoulders. He has to walk uphill almost a mile to the Via Dolorosa, up to Golgotha, where he will be crucified. He hasn't even gotten on the cross yet, and this is the kind of condition he's in. He couldn't carry the crossbar. He was so weakened by blood loss and shock that he collapsed in the street. So they pulled a guy right out of the crowd, Simon of Cyrene, and made him carry the crossbar up to Golgotha. And there they crucified him. They drove spikes through his wrists, through his feet, through his heel bones, and attached him to the cross. And then they lifted the cross up and dropped it in a hole, and sometimes their joints would be pulled out of socket. And then, as he hung there, in order to breathe, he'd have to push himself up on the spike to gasp, to catch a breath, and then he'd let himself down again. And people often died by suffocation or cardiac arrest. Did Jesus die on the cross? Is it possible that he only swooned or he only fainted? There was an article in the American Medical Journal of the AMA, and I haven't read it, but it says that there's just no possible way a human being can survive this kind of treatment. And when he died, he looked like he was dead. But to make sure, a Roman soldier took a spear and drove it into Jesus' side to ensure that Jesus was dead. There's no question. The first question of Sir Lionel Luckhoo was he dead? He was dead. Second question, did they bury him? And the answer to that question is this: they took Jesus' body down off of the cross, and Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, went to Pilate and asked for his body. Can I have his body? And Pilate said, "Yes, you can." And so Joseph took him and he buried him in the family tomb. And they buried him. It was the Passover. They rolled the stone in front of the entrance to the tomb. It wasn't a secret where he was buried. It wasn't a secret what happened to the body. Why is this an issue? Because again, there are critical scholars that don't believe, who want to kind of do away with the evidence that the scriptures and the extra biblical witnesses say about this. And one of them, John Dominic Crossan, says, well, they took Jesus' body down, the Romans took it down, and they pitched his body into Gehenna, which was the trash dump of Jerusalem where he was eaten by wild dogs. There's no evidence for that. He made it up. But he's a scholar, and this is a scholarly opinion. No, the scholarly opinion is that Jesus was laid in the tomb, that Jesus was indeed buried. I don't know if you saw this past week, but a new movie opened up over at the Frank Theaters, The Case for Christ, and it's the story of Lee Strobel, who was a pagan, a heathen. He was a skeptic. He was a militant atheist. He didn't believe in the faith at all. In fact, he believed that Christianity was a fairy tale. It was a myth. It was a fable. And you know how those things work. You know, George Washington chops down the cherry tree and then says, "I cannot tell a lie." No historian believes that that actually happened, but these myths, these stories kind of take on a life of their own over the course of time. I grew up in the early 60s, and so every week I would watch Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone was a man. Everybody, no, you don't have to do that. If you're a little bit older than I am, then you'll remember that Fess Parker played Davy Crockett with the same coonskin cap on his head. But what they put on the TV had nothing to do with the human being that bore that name. It's just these legends and these stories that grew up over time. Now, you know how that works. Ever been fishing with your grandfather? He takes you to the stream, and he casts his line, and he puts it out there in the water, and after a few minutes, the bobber sinks. And so he starts fighting with the fish, and he starts reeling it into the right and reeling it into the left, and he's reeling this fish in, and he tells you to get the net. And he brings it right up to the edge of the stream, and he's fighting with this fish, and you get the net, and you pull it out, and the fish is like that big. It's a sardine. However, by the time that the 4th of July picnic comes around, it was a pike. It was the biggest fish he'd ever caught in his life, and it put up the biggest fight he'd ever had in his life. That's legends, that's myth, that's how those things work. Lee Strobel, in his book, The Case for Christ. Now, the movie's more about how he came to write the book, not the contents of the book. It's the story of his marriage. His wife had come to faith in Jesus, and he was just outraged. She's committed intellectual suicide. She's lost her mind. She's taken leave of her senses. She's got an imaginary friend. She's all the things that skeptics in our world say about Christians is how he felt about what his wife had done. He worked for the Chicago Tribune, and there was another Christian reporter there who challenged him and said, well, what do you do when you're given a job to report something? You go and you collect the facts and you examine the evidence and you sift it and then you write the story. I challenge you to do the same thing about the Christian faith. And so in his book, The Case for Christ, Lee Strobel boiled it down to the 3 E's. The first one is early witnesses. So if you've got your Bibles, and if you don't, I'd encourage you to take them out. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And it's on page 961 in your pew Bibles, verses 3 through 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. The first E for Lee Strobel was early witnesses. Was there time for all of these myths and all of these legends to accumulate and to get told? And 1 Corinthians was written in maybe 32, 34 AD. Now, the guys that decided to date time after Jesus, they're off just a little bit. Some say he was born in 3 BC. Some say he was born in 6 BC. Probably not January 1st, 0. Probably not. But he died around, give or take, 30 AD. 1 Corinthians was written within 2 or maybe 4 years of the events that it describes. Not enough time for legends and myths to accumulate all of the baggage and all of the stuff. And what does Paul say there? I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. So what you're looking at right there is a creed of the early church. This is what the church taught. Paul had an experience with the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, and he came to faith having this personal experience with the risen Jesus Christ. And so the pillars of the church in Jerusalem said, you can't go out and teach and preach until you come here first. We've got to vet you. We've got to make sure that you're teaching what we teach, and let's get on the same page here. So Paul goes back to Jerusalem. I delivered to you, the Corinthians, as of first importance what I myself received. That Jesus died according to the Scriptures. That he was buried. And that on the 3rd day he rose again according to the Scriptures. And then he appeared. He appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12, and then to as many as 500 of the brothers, many of whom are still alive, though a few have fallen asleep. In other words, some of them have died. But what Paul is saying is, don't take my word for it. The people who saw the risen Christ, who had an experience with the risen Lord, they can come and they can testify to you. You can ask them, did you indeed see this Jesus? It's not a story. It's not a myth. We don't throw ourselves blindly into the universe. We check it out, resting on the sufficiency of the evidence. The second E is the empty tomb. How do you explain away the fact that where's the body of Jesus? The Jews didn't want Christianity to get going. They wanted to stamp this thing out. So the first thing that the Jews would do, the Jewish authorities would go to the grave, roll away the stone, pull out the body of Jesus, put it in a wheelbarrow, roll it up to the temple and say, hey, he didn't rise, there he is, this whole thing's a joke, forget about it. Jews didn't have his body. The Romans, Pax Romana, they were all about maintaining the peace and not allowing dissent to foment and to have riots, and they wanted things quiet and peaceful. For the same reasons, they would have trotted out the body and said, here is your dead Messiah. There wouldn't be anything there. But nobody could produce the body. What about the disciples? Some say the disciples stole the body. Think about that for just a second. Of the original 12, Judas will take him out, 11. All of them died a martyr's death, brutal martyr's death. Peter was crucified upside down. Thomas was hammered to pieces with a hammer in India. They all died a gruesome martyrs. If it was a lie, if they'd stolen the body and hidden the body, why would they continue to promulgate this lie? And why would they die for it in the face of death and torture? It doesn't make any sense. The only thing that accounts for it is he rose on Easter, as we're here gathered to celebrate and to worship him. And then the third E was eyewitnesses. Again, we have Peter. We have Paul, who had his own personal experience with Jesus. Paul was a hater of the Christian faith, and his life was radically changed by this encounter with the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus. And he went from being Saul, the persecutor of the faith, the murderer of Christians, to Paul, who was the chief apostle and the greatest missionary in the early church. Simon Luckhoo said that the proof for the faith is incontrovertible. Lee Strobel, a skeptic, didn't want to believe this, came to faith in this Jesus because he couldn't get rid of the facts, resting on the sufficiency of the evidence. He's not the only one to do this. Josh McDowell was a skeptic, and he came to faith in Jesus by investigating the faith. Frank Morrison wrote a book called Who Moved the Stone? Like Lee Strobel, he was a journalist, and he didn't believe it, so he investigated it, and he came to faith. Lee Strobel, The Case for Christ. C.S. Lewis. In the late 18th century, a man by the name of Fraser collected stories of myths about the dying and rising gods, and it's called A Golden Bough. And it was a way to dismiss the faith. See, Christians believe what cultures all around the world believe, these dying and rising gods. And C.S. Lewis was a skeptic. He was an enemy of the faith. And he had a friend by the name of Hugo Dyson, also an atheist, an enemy of the faith. And just as a throwaway, sarcastically, as kind of a joke, Hugo Dyson said to him once, "Rum thing, it looks like it actually happened once, this dying and rising God." And that stuck in Lewis's craw. And over the course of time, and by the encouragement of other believers like J.R.R. Tolkien, Lewis came to faith in Jesus Christ. The evidence exists for us to have faith. We don't need to be ashamed. We don't need to pretend like it's just this blind leap. We close our eyes, we commit intellectual suicide, we throw ourselves in there. That's what the world says that we do, but it's not what I did. My young life leader challenged me. You don't believe this stuff? Then go try to figure out then what's another story? What's another way to explain the events that occurred on Easter morning? We gather this morning to worship a risen Lord. Mary went to the tomb. She expected to find a dead body because that's what we would all expect. And when she got there, there was no body. The story's the same. The rhythm's the same. He died, he was buried, he rose. Read the resurrection narratives. Read Philo. Read Josephus. They're not Christians, but they say this is what was reported, and they don't have any other explanation for it. On this Easter Sunday morning, let me encourage you to plant Christ in your heart and see if he doesn't rise in glory and majesty and splendor in your lives. Amen.